Have you ever seen an animal look at a human like it understood their pain? July 16, 2025. 3:47 a.m. Rain tapped against the hospital window like tiny, impatient fingers. Outside, the world felt drowned. Streetlights bleeding gold into wet asphalt. Cars hissing through puddles. Empty playground swings shuddering in the wind. But inside room 312, silence hung thick as gauze. Sarah traced the edge of her son's blanket, her fingers trembling. Liam lay still beneath it, a small, pale island in a sea of white sheets. His chest rose and fell in shallow hitches, each breath a battle against the pneumonia that had ambushed his leukemia-weakened body. Machines hummed, their green lights blinking like lonely stars. Beep, beep, beep. A sound that had carved grooves into Sarah's soul these past 9 months. She hadn't slept in 32 hours. Coffee churned sour in her stomach. Her reflection in the dark window showed hollow eyes. Hair pulled into a fraying knot. Lips bitten raw. Guilt was a stone in her throat. If only I'd noticed his fever sooner. If only I hadn't been so tired, so distracted. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, mocking her. A shadow moved near the door. The cat sat just beyond the threshold, a silhouette carved from midnight. He'd followed the ambulance to the hospital 3 days ago, refusing to stay home with Sarah's sister. He'd slipped past nurses, dodged orderlies, vanished into stairwells, until he'd found Liam's room. No one had the heart to evict him. Now he lingered there, day and night, a silent sentinel. He was an unremarkable cat, really. Jet black fur, slightly matted near his left hip. One ear notched from an old fight. A thin white scar cutting through the dark fur like a chalk line. The shelter had named him Shadow. But Liam, then 6 and obsessed with fairy tales, declared him Bear. Because he wasn't fluffy or cuddly, but solid, like something you could lean on. For 2 years, Bear had been present but distant. He'd sleep on the couch, not Liam's bed, the pet's, but never purred loudly. A ghost in his own home, until Liam got sick. Bear's eyes, huge and amber, fixed on the boy. Not the machines. Not the 4-pole dripping poison and hope into his veins. Just Liam. His gaze held a weight, a stillness, that made Sarah's breath catch. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. Sarah remembered finding Bear at the shelter. He'd been surrendered after his elderly owner died. Curled in the back of a steel cage. Eyes vacant. Liam had pressed his small face against the bars. He looked sad, Mommy. Can we take his sad away? Bear had lifted his head then, and stared at the boy. That same heavy, amber stare. Beep, beep, beep. Liam whimpered in his sleep, a thin, broken sound. Sarah jolted, her hand flying to his forehead. Still too warm. Still fighting. She swallowed a sob. Helplessness was a vice around her ribs. Bear's tail twitched. Just once. A flicker of movement in the dim hallway light. He took a single step forward, paused soundless on the linoleum. Then another. His nose wrinkled, taking in the antiseptic sting of the room. The sour tang of fear. One paw hovering over the threshold. Sarah held her breath. He'd never crossed it. Not once. He'd sit, watch. He'd even curl up just outside the door. But he'd never entered. Nurses whispered it was the smell of medicine or the hum of machines. Sarah wondered if it was the ghost of grief, the one Bear carried from his first owner's deathbed, haunting him here. Liam whimpered again. a tear slipping down his temple. Sarah brushed it away with her thumb. "Sure, baby. Mommy's here," she whispered, her voice cracking. Bear's ears flattened. Not in fear. Resolve. So deliberately, he placed that hovering paw down. Inside the room, Sarah's heart stuttered. Bear didn't look at her. His entire focus was on Liam. He moved like smoke, flowing across the floor until he reached the bed. For a long moment, he just stood there, looking up at the boy. With a grace that belied his sturdy frame, he leaped onto the mattress. The plastic cover crinkled faintly under his weight. He didn't curl up at Liam's feet, like Sarah expected. He walked right up the length of the bed, past the tangle of tubes and wires, and stopped beside Liam's thin shoulder. Liam's eyelids fluttered open, hazy with fever and drugs. He blinked, focusing slowly on the black shape beside him. A tiny smile touched his cracked lips. "Bear." He breathed, a sigh of pure relief. The cat lowered his head, not to nuzzle, not to lick. He pressed his forehead firmly against Liam's cheek, right where the tear had been. He held it there, a still point, a bridge. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Tears blurred the harsh room, the humming machines, the rain-streaked night. All she saw was her small, suffering son, and the scarred, stray cat, forehead to cheek. A silent communion. Bear didn't purr. He didn't move. Simply anchored. The relentless beep, beep, beep of the monitor seemed to soften just for a heartbeat. Liam's breathing deepened as his eyes drifted closed again. The ghost of that tiny smile lingered. Sarah watched, her own tears falling hot and fast onto her scrubs. This cat, this quiet, scarred creature who'd held his own sorrow so close, had just crossed an invisible line. Not just into a hospital room, but into the raw, trembling heart of her fear. What did he know? The rain whispered secrets against the glass. Bear remained, forehead pressed to Liam's skin, unmoving. His amber eyes, half closed, reflected the dim light, holding a depth Sarah couldn't name. Something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the heavy air between heartbeats. A quiet, impossible thing, settling into the space where hope felt too fragile to breathe. The vigil had changed. Bear wasn't just watching anymore. He was staying. And in the stillness, Sarah felt the first faint tremor, not of fear this time, but of wonder. A tiny, fragile shift, beginning in the deepest chamber of her wounded heart. The rain didn't stop. For 3 days, it wept against the hospital windows, a constant, gray companion to the hushed terror inside room 312. But something else had taken root in that sterile space. Something warm and quiet and utterly unexpected. But he hadn't moved from Liam's bedside. Not truly. He'd shift positions, curling tight against the boy's fragile hip, or stretching along his side, his forehead often still resting against Liam's cheek or arm, a living, breathing compress. Sarah watched, her initial shock softening into a fragile awe. She'd seen therapy dogs, read about their calm presence, but this felt different, deeper, older. Bear wasn't performing. He wasn't seeking praise. Simply was present, attentive in a way that bypassed training and tapped into something primal. Instinct? Empathy? Sarah didn't know. She only knew the crushing weight on her chest, the one that made drawing breath feel like shoveling gravel. Just a fraction. When she watched the steady rise and fall of the cat's dark fur against her son's pale skin, the nurses noticed a veteran with kind eyes and hands that moved with gentle certainty. Paused during Liam's vitals check one gray afternoon. She didn't touch Bear, just observed him, his amber eyes fixed on Liam's face. Even in sleep. "He's not blocking access," Marie murmured, more to herself than Sarah. "He's aware. Positions himself clear of the lines every time." She adjusted Liam's oxygen tube, her gaze lingering on the cat. Some animals, had a collie once, sat by a diabetic child's bed, would whimper minutes before a sugar crash. Never trained it, just knew. She met Sarah's exhausted eyes. This one, he's got that same stillness. Like he's listening to something we can't hear. Listening. That's exactly what it felt like. Bear seemed attuned to the subtlest shifts in Liam. A slight hitch in the boy's shallow breathing, barely audible over the machines, would bring Bear's head up instantly. His ears would pivot forward, radar dishes tuning into a faint signal. He'd watch Liam's face intently, sometimes emitting the softest chirp, a sound Sarah had never heard him make before. It wasn't a meow. It was more like a question. "Are you okay?" Liam, drifting in the fog of fever and medication, responded to Bear in ways he couldn't to anyone else. When pain tightened his small features into a grimace, Bear would press closer, a low, rumbling purr vibrating through his own body and into Liam's. It wasn't the loud, contented purr of a cat basking in sunshine. This was deeper, more resonant, a physical hum Sarah could feel in her own bones when she sat near the bed. Liam's clenched fists would gradually relax, his furrowed brow smoothing out, as if the vibration itself was untangling knots of discomfort. "Bear's engine?" Liam would murmur, his voice a threadbare whisper. Before slipping back into uneasy sleep, Sarah lived in a suspended state. She dozed fitfully in the stiff vinyl armchair, jolted awake by every machine beep, every rustle of the curtain. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of this room, the rhythms of Liam's illness, the silent vigil of a black cat. Guilt, her constant gnawing companion, whispered terrible things in the quiet hours. You missed the signs. You were too tired, too focused on work and bills, on just getting through the day. This is your fault. The sterile air smelled of antiseptic, stale coffee, and the underlying, metallic tang of fear. One rain-lashed night, the machine screaming a sudden, terrifying alarm as Liam's oxygen levels plummeted. Sarah's fragile control shattered. Nurses rushed in, voices clipped and urgent. Liam thrashed weakly, confused and gasping. Sarah was pushed gently but firmly aside, her body trembling violently, her vision blurring with panic. She backed into the corner, near the window where the rain blurred the city lights into smears of color. Her knees buckled. She slid down the cold wall, pulling her knees to her chest, burying her face in her hands. The sobs tore out of her, harsh, ragged things, echoing the frantic beeping of the monitors. Helpless, useless, a failure. She didn't hear him approach. One moment she was drowning in the dark well of her terror. Then she felt it. Pressure against her shin. Sarah lifted her tear-drowned eyes. Bear stood beside her. He'd left Liam's side. For the first time since he'd entered the room, the nurses were adjusting Liam's mask, their movements swift and focused. The alarms were silencing, one by one, leaving a ringing quiet in their wake. Liam's breathing was evening out, ragged but steadying. Bear wasn't looking at the bed. He was looking at her. Those huge, amber eyes held hers, reflecting the dim emergency light above the door. There was no judgment there, no expectation. A profound, quiet seeing. He did something simple, something utterly shattering. He lifted a single front paw, not to bat at her or demand attention. He placed it, deliberately, on top of her clenched fist, where it rested on her knee. His paw was warm, surprisingly heavy. The pads were rough against her skin. He didn't retract his claws. He just rested it there. A grounding weight. A silent "I am here too." Sarah froze. The storm of her sobs hiccuped into silence. She stared at the black paw covering her white-knuckled fist, at the notched ear, tilted slightly towards her. She could feel the faint thrum of his purr, vibrating up her arm, a counter-rhythm to her own frantic heartbeat. So tentative. She uncurled her other hand from her face. She reached out, her fingers trembling. She didn't go for his head or his back. Almost instinctively, her hand moved towards the spot she'd noticed that first night, the slightly matted fur near his left hip. As her fingertips brushed the dense, dark fur, she felt it, not just mats. Beneath the fur, a ridge of thickened, twisted skin. A scar, deeper than the notch on his ear. A hidden map of some past pain. Bear didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. To slightly, into her touch. His purr deepened, growing louder. A resonant rumble that filled the space between them, drowning out the last echoes of the alarms. The frantic pulse in Sarah's ears. He kept his paw firmly on her fist. Sarah's breath hitched. Not in a sob this time, but in a gasp of pure, bewildered connection. Her tears still flowed, hot and silent, but the crushing weight, the isolating terror, just enough to let her breathe. She wasn't alone in this corner. This scarred creature, who carried his own hidden history of loss, had crossed another invisible line. He hadn't just come for Liam. He was here for her. She curled her fingers gently into his fur, feeling the warmth, the solid muscle beneath, the steady vibration of his purr. She traced the edge of the old scar, a silent acknowledgement. "I see it too." Across the room, Liam sighed, a long, slow exhalation, and settled into a deeper, more peaceful sleep than he'd had in days. The rain continued its soft percussion against the glass. The green lights on the machines blinked their steady, reassuring cadence. Beep, beep, beep. Sarah stayed on the floor, leaning against the cold wall, her hand buried in Bear's dark fur, his paw a warm anchor on her hand. The guilt didn't vanish. The fear didn't dissolve. But in that quiet corner, with the purring cat sharing her vigil, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt since this nightmare began. A fragile, unexpected sense of being held. Not physically, but in a way that reached far deeper. Bear's quiet presence wasn't magic. It was companionship, a shared burden, a silent promise whispered in warmth and fur and the rhythm of a deep, rumbling purr that said, "You are not alone in this dark room." And for the first time in months, Sarah believed it. The rain finally broke, bleeding away into a pale, watery dawn on the fourth day. Sunlight, weak and tentative, filtered through the high hospital windows, touching the sterile surfaces with hesitant gold. Room 312 felt different. Healed, not safe, but somehow anchored. Bear had become part of the room's ecosystem, a silent, dark planet orbiting the fragile sun of Liam's bed. Nurses stepped around him. Doctors noted his presence with curious, sometimes skeptical glances. But no one challenged him anymore. He'd earned his place. Liam's fever had receded, leaving him washed out, fragile as blown glass, but lucid. His eyes, when they opened, held a flicker of their old light, often finding Bear first. "Hey, Bear Man," he'd rasp, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. His thin hand would lift, trembling, to rest lightly on the cat's head or back. Bear would accept the touch, his purr a steady, grounding thrum. But his gaze rarely left Liam's face for long. Sarah existed in a new kind of exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness laced with fragile threads of hope. She'd started showering in the family lounge, grabbing sandwiches from the cafeteria. The crushing guilt hadn't vanished. But Bear's quiet presence, his unflinching vigil, acted like a buffer against its sharpest edges. She'd even managed a few hours of solid sleep in the armchair one night, lulled by the dual rhythm of Liam's steadying breaths and Bear's deep purr. Hope, she discovered, could be terrifying. It made the potential for another fall so much steeper. Then Bear started doing something strange. It began subtly. Liam was propped up slightly, sipping weak broth Sarah coaxed into him. Bear lay curled beside his hip, as usual. Suddenly, the cat's head snapped up, not towards Liam, but towards the doorway. His ears flattened, not aggressively, but with intense focus. His amber eyes fixed on the empty space just beyond the threshold. A low growl, so deep Sarah felt it more than heard it, vibrated in his chest. It lasted only a few seconds. Then Bear blinked, shook his head slightly, and settled back down, nuzzling Liam's arm. Sarah chalked it up to a noise in the hall. But it happened again, and again, always when Liam was at his most peaceful, drifting in sleep or quietly watching cartoons on the small TV. Bear would tense, his gaze locking onto that same spot near the doorway, or sometimes, disturbingly, towards the corner of the room near the window. The low growl would rumble, brief but intense. His tail would twitch, not lazily, but in sharp, agitated flicks. As suddenly as it started, it would stop. Bear would press closer to Liam, his purr returning, louder, almost urgent. Sarah tried to see what he saw. Nothing. Just empty space. The flickering fluorescent light? A shadow cast by a passing cart? But Bear's reaction felt personal, not startled, wary, protective, like he was seeing something Sarah couldn't. It unsettled her deeply. "He's just a cat," she told herself firmly, scrubbing Liam's face with a cool cloth. "He hears things we don't. Rats in the walls, machines down the hall." But the explanation felt thin, brittle. It didn't account for the focused intensity, the way his gaze tracked something moving across the space, or the way Liam, even in his drowsy state, would sometimes murmur, "Bear? What's wrong?" When the cat tensed beside him, the tension coiled tighter inside Sarah. Every moment of peace felt borrowed, frail. She jumped at sudden noises. The hiss of Liam's four-pump restarting, the squeak of a nurse's shoes, sent adrenaline spiking through her veins. She watched Bear like a hawk, his every twitch a potential omen. The fragile trust she'd built, the sense of being held, began to fray under the strain of this new, silent mystery. What was he reacting to? Was it a sign? A warning of some impending downturn? Her mind, starved of sleep and saturated with fear, began painting terrifying pictures. Was it death he sensed? lingering near the door? The thought was a cold knife twisting in her gut. One afternoon, a different kind of shadow fell across the doorway. Dr. Evans, Liam's oncologist? A woman with a brisk manner softened by kind eyes. She carried a chart, her expression carefully neutral. Sarah's heart plummeted. Neutral was never good news. "Sarah," Dr. Evans began, her voice low and steady. "Liam's latest blood work." She paused, glancing at the boy asleep. Bear a dark comma against his side. "The pneumonia is responding well to the antibiotics." "That's excellent." "His white blood cell count, it's not rebounding as we'd hoped." "Leukemia, it's proving more aggressive than we anticipated." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Aggressive? She gripped the edge of the chair, knuckles white. What does that mean?" Her voice sounded thin, distant. "It means we need to escalate treatment sooner than planned," Dr. Evans said gently, firmly. "We need to start the next phase of chemotherapy. Immediately. Tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word echoed in the suddenly too small room. The poison meant to save him. That would also make him violently sick. The battle wasn't over. It was just changing fronts, becoming uglier. Sarah felt the familiar vice of helplessness tightening around her chest. She looked at Liam, so small, so pale against the pillows. How could his tiny body withstand more? "The side effects," Sarah whispered, dreading the answer. "Will be significant," Dr. Evans confirmed, her gaze compassionate but unwavering. "Nausea, fatigue, increased risk of infection. We'll manage it, support him every step. But Sarah, we need to prepare him, and ourselves, to face. It's tough." As if sensing the shift in the room's heavy air, Bear stirred. He lifted his head, not towards the doctor, but towards Sarah. His amber eyes met hers, holding a depth of understanding that stole her breath. He saw the terror, the despair threatening to drown her anew. Deliberately, he turned his head and looked, not at the doorway this time, but directly at Dr. Evans. And he growled, not the low, rumbling warning from before. This was sharper, clearer, a low, sustained vibration of sound, deep in his throat. His ears flattened fully against his skull. His body tense, not to flee, but as if ready to spring. His gaze was fixed, unyielding, on the doctor. Dr. Evans blinked, taken aback. "Well," she murmured, a flicker of surprise crossing her professional composure. "Someone's protective." Sarah's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and a strange, fierce pride. "But it's okay," she said softly, reaching out. But the cat didn't look at her. His focus remained entirely on the doctor, the bearer of the terrible, necessary news. The growl subsided into a tense silence, but the warning in his posture remained. "Back off." "Very attached," Sarah offered weakly. "Remarkably so," Dr. Evans said, her gaze thoughtful as she studied the cat. "He perceives threat. Interesting." She didn't seem offended. Intrigued, perhaps. She finished updating the chart, offered Sarah a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder, and left. The moment the door clicked shut, Bear's tension dissolved. He exhaled a soft huff of air, turned, nuzzled Liam's sleeping hand, and settled back down, his purr restarting, a low, steady thrum. Sarah sank back into the chair, her legs trembling. The news about the chemo was a crushing weight. But Bear's reaction, so visceral, so directed, added a new layer of unease. He wasn't just sensing unseen shadows anymore. He was interpreting the human world, reading intentions, emotions. And he'd perceived Dr. Evans, the woman trying to save Liam, as a threat in that moment of delivering hard truth. But was it the tension in Sarah's voice? The scent of her fear? Or something else? Something tied to his own past? The scar on his hip? The notched ear? They spoke of conflict, of pain delivered by hands he might have once trusted. Was he seeing ghosts of his own trauma in Sarah's despair? Projecting his fear onto the doctor? Sarah looked at the cat, this complex, scarred creature sharing their ordeal. He wasn't just a comfort anymore. He was a mirror, reflecting back her own terror, her own defensiveness against the world that was hurting her child. His vigilance, once a solace, now felt charged with a darker energy, a shared paranoia. Later that night, as Liam slept fitfully, anticipating the storm of chemo to come, Bear tensed again, not towards the door this time. He was lying on Liam's chest, the position he'd started favoring, feeling the boy's heartbeat directly beneath him. Suddenly, his head jerked up. She stared, not at the door, not at the window, but at the four-pole standing sentinel beside the bed, at the clear bag of saline solution, dripping life into Liam's vein. He stared at it with unwavering intensity. His ears pricked forward, then swiveled back. A low whine, a sound Sarah had never heard from him, escaped his throat. It wasn't a growl. It was distress, confusion. He lifted a paw, hesitantly, towards the plastic tube snaking down from the bag to Liam's arm. "No, Bear," Sarah whispered sharply, lurching forward from her chair. She couldn't risk him pawing at the line. Bear flinched at her tone, retracting his paw instantly. He looked at her, then back at the four, then down at Liam. The whine subsided into a troubled silence. He lowered his head back onto Liam's chest, but his body remained tense, wide and watchful, flicked repeatedly between Liam's face and the four bag. Distrust, clear, unmistakable distrust, focused on the very thing keeping Liam hydrated, delivering his medicines. Sarah froze, her hand hovering near Bear's back. This wasn't about shadows or doctors. This was about the treatment itself. Tubes, the dripping liquid. Bear associated it with, what? Pain? Betrayal? The memory of his own scar, inflicted perhaps in a cage, by needles or instruments he didn't understand. The fragile piece shattered. A new, chilling tension crackled in the room. The machines hummed. Liam breathed shallowly. The four dripped its steady rhythm. Bear watched the bag, his amber eyes reflecting the cold, fluorescent light, holding a silent vigil against an enemy Sarah couldn't see, but whose presence, in the cat's haunted memory, was terrifyingly real. The battle lines weren't just drawn around Liam's failing body anymore. They were drawn in the mind of a scarred cat, and reflected in the deepening dread of a mother facing a brutal tomorrow. What happened when the poison started flowing? When the real pain began? Would Bear see it as an attack? And what, in his fierce, protective love, might he do? The question hung in the sterile air. A terrifying turning point in their shared vigil. Dawn bled into room 312, not with hope, but with the cold, clinical light of preparation. The cheerful yellow curtains seemed to mock the grim ritual unfolding. Nurses moved with efficient quietness, laying out plastic back pads, anti-nausea medication, bags of clear, chilling fluid marked with stark biohazard symbols. The air hummed with a different tension now. The smell of rubbing alcohol overpowering the lingering antiseptic. Liam was awake, paler than the pillowcase. He watched the preparations with wide, terrified eyes. His small fingers clutching Bear's fur so tightly his knuckles were bloodless. Bear lay rigid against him, a tense line of black fur. His amber eyes weren't fixed on Liam's face now, but locked onto the nurse, as she meticulously checked the new four-line, the thicker tube than before, leading to a fresh port taped securely to Liam's chest. Bear's low growl was a constant, vibrating undercurrent, barely audible, but Sarah felt it thrumming through the mattress. His ears were pinned flat, his tail a stiff metronome of dread. The saline drip sounded like a countdown. "All right, sweetheart," Marie said, her voice deliberately soft. "Big deep breaths for me, okay? This medicine's a strong fighter, gonna help you beat those bad cells. Might make you feel a bit yucky afterwards, but we've got magic potions right here to help with that." She held up a syringe of anti-nausea meds. Liam just whimpered, pressing his face into Bear's side. Sarah stood frozen by the window, her own stomach churning. She'd signed the consent forms. She knew it was necessary, logical, but watching them prepare to flood her child's fragile body with poison, watching Bear's primal terror mirror her own, it felt like betrayal. Her hands trembled violently at her sides. She wanted to scream, to grab Liam and run, to shield him from what was coming. Helplessness was a suffocating shroud. "Here we go," Marie said gently. She connected the first chemo bag to the four-line. A thin, clear stream joined the saline, flowing into the tube, towards Liam's vein. Bear exploded, not in attack, in pure, visceral horror. He didn't leap at Marie. He reared back on Liam's chest, the sound like tearing silk, ferocious and terrified. His claws extended, puncturing the thin hospital blanket, but miraculously not Liam's skin. This huge and wild, fixed on the thin stream entering the four-port taped to Liam's chest. He swatted at the air above it, as if trying to bat away an invisible swarm. "No!" Sarah cried. Lunging forward, Liam screamed, a raw, ragged sound of fear, amplified by Bear's panic. "Bear, stop. It hurts." He tried to push the cat away, but he was too weak. Bear was a writhing, spitting knot of black fur on his chest, fixated on the port, the dripping poison. "Sarah, I need you to get the cat," Marie commanded, her calm fractured, trying to shield the four-line with her body. Another nurse rushed in. Chaos. Beeping machines. Liam's terrified sobs. Bear's furious, desperate hissing. Sarah's vision tunneled. The scar. Bear's scar. The thick, twisted ridge beneath the matted fur near his left hip. A port? An old foresight? Affected? Neglected? The image slammed into her with the force of revelation. He knew this pain. Not sensed it, remembered it. Burning poison in the vein. Betrayal by hands that were supposed to help. The terror wasn't just for Liam. It was his terror. Resurrected. He wasn't seeing a shadow. He was seeing his own past being inflicted on his boy. Bear. Sarah's voice cut through the cacophony. Not sharp, but shattered. She didn't reach to grab him. She dropped to her knees beside the bed, right in his line of sight, blocking his view of the port, the nurses. She held her hands up, palms open. Tears streamed down her face. Bear. Her voice breaking. I know it hurts. I know you remember. I know you're scared. For him, for you. The cat froze mid-hiss. His wild, amber eyes snapped to hers. The ferocity faltered, replaced by a confusion so deep it was agony. He panted, mouth slightly open, his body still trembling with adrenaline. Liam sobbed weakly beneath him. It's poison, Sarah whispered, the awful truth spilling out. It's awful, burns, it makes you sick. You remember, don't you? That pain, that scar. Her gaze dropped instinctively to his left hip. Bear flinched, a full body shudder. He knew she knew. But Bear. Sarah reached out, so slowly, not towards his head, but towards that hidden ridge on his hip. It's poison that fights a worse poison. It's terrible, but it's the only way. Please, please trust me. Please let them help him. I'm so scared too. Her fingertips brushed the matted fur, finding the familiar ridge of scar tissue beneath. Bear didn't hiss. He didn't pull away. He stared at her, just heaving. The wild panic in his eyes slowly, agonizingly, melting into something else. Recognition? Shared despair? A dawning, terrible understanding? A low, guttural whine escaped him, a sound of profound grief, of surrender. The fight drained out of him, leaving him trembling, exhausted. He lowered his head, not onto Liam, but onto Sarah's outstretched hand resting near his scar. His warm forehead pressed into her palm. A weight, a confession. I remember. It hurts. I'm afraid. Sarah choked on a sob. She curled her fingers gently, cradling his head, feeling the rapid flutter of his pulse against her skin. I know, she breathed, her forehead touching his. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you know this pain. We have to be brave for him. Together. Please, stay with us. The room was utterly silent now. The nurses stood frozen, watching. Liam's sobs had quieted to hiccuping shudders, his wide eyes fixed on his mother and his cat, foreheads touching, united in a silent pact of shared terror and love. The chemo continued to flow, plink, 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 into his vein. Bear lifted his head from Sarah's hand. He looked at Liam, then back at Sarah. The wildness was gone, replaced by a heartbreaking weariness, and a resolve that seemed to settle deep into his bones. He turned slowly, deliberately, on Liam's chest. He didn't look at the foreport. He didn't look at the bag. He lowered his entire body, stretching out along Liam's torso, covering the boy's chest and the small, taped port site completely with his own warm, dark fur. A living shield, not against the medicine anymore, but against the fear of it. He began to lick, not Liam's face, not his hand. He bent his head, and with infinite gentleness, began to lick the thin plastic tape securing the foreport to Liam's pale skin. So, meticulous strokes of his rough tongue, over and over, as if he could groom away the intrusion, the memory of pain, as if he could heal it with the only medicine he truly understood. Presence. The simple, fierce act of caring for a wound. Sarah collapsed forward, her arms wrapping around both of them, her son and his scarred guardian. Great, racking sobs tore through her, releasing the dam of terror, helplessness that had held her captive for months. She buried her face in Bear's fur, smelling the familiar scent of dust and warmth, mingled now with hospital sterility and Liam's fever-sweet skin. She felt Liam's small hand creep up, tangling in her hair, and Bear's relentless, gentle licking against the tape on his chest. It's okay, Mommy, Liam whispered hoarsely, his voice thin but clear. Bear's fixing it. Marie moved quietly, checking the flow. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She didn't speak. None of them did. The only sounds were Sarah's diminishing sobs, Liam's shaky breaths, the soft, rhythmic rasp of Bear's tongue, and the relentless, plink, plink, plink of the poison dripping into the vein of the boy sheltered beneath a black cat's love. The breaking point wasn't a shattering. It was an unraveling, a laying bare of the deepest, most vulnerable truths. Sarah's guilt, her consuming fear of failing her child, Bear's hidden trauma, his terror born of remembered pain. In that chaotic, tear-drenched moment, they had seen each other, truly seen. The scars, inside and out, and in that scene, in Bear's instinctive, desperate act of licking the wound, they had found a way to hold the terror together, not to banish it, but to face it, side by side, fur and skin, trembling hand and rough tongue. The vigil wasn't just about waiting anymore. It was about enduring. Together, the chemo flowed. The storm was inside Liam now, but in room 312, cradled in a tangle of love and shared history, a different kind of quiet settled, but undeniably whole. The fragile boy, the broken mother, and the scarred cat who remembered poison had become an island. And on that island, for the first time, Sarah felt the terrifying, tentative flutter of something she'd almost forgotten. Unconditional love. Not just for Liam, but for the fierce, damaged creature who had crossed every line to share their burden. And in doing so, had shown her she wasn't broken beyond repair. She was simply human. And so was he. The tears that fell now onto Bear's dark fur weren't just tears of fear. They were tears of release, of gratitude, of a connection forged in the white-hot crucible of shared suffering. The battle wasn't won, but the loneliness, the crushing, isolating loneliness, was gone, washed away in a flood of understanding, and the soft, persistent rasp of a cat's tongue, tending a wound, offering the only comfort he knew how to give. The relentless beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor became the metronome of their new reality. Chemo wasn't a single storm. It was a climate, a harsh, unyielding landscape of nausea, bone-deep fatigue, and a vulnerability so profound it felt like Liam's skin had turned to tissue paper. The poison did its brutal work. Within hours of that first infusion, the fragile bloom of color that had briefly touched Liam's cheeks vanished. He retched until he trembled, dry heaves racking his small frame long after his stomach was empty. He couldn't keep down water. Even ice chips melted on his tongue only to come back up. He shivered under layers of blankets, then burned with phantom fevers moments later. When they opened, lost in a fog of misery Sarah couldn't penetrate, room 312 became a crucible. The tentative sunlight of the previous day felt like a cruel joke. The fluorescent lights buzzed relentlessly, casting sharp shadows that seemed to emphasize the hollows under Liam's eyes, the sharp angles of his collarbones. The air hung thick with the sour tang of vomit, the cloying sweetness of anti-nausea medication, and the underlying, ever-present scent of fear, now laced with despair. Sarah moved like a ghost herself, mopping Liam's brow, holding the basin, murmuring empty comforts that sounded hollow even to her own ears. "It's okay, baby. It's work. Just breathe." Her own stomach churned in sympathetic agony. The guilt roared back, a savage beast, You did this. You let them pump poison into him. Bear became Liam's shadow, not just physically present, but attuned on a cellular level. His vigil transformed. No longer tense defiance, but a profound, exhausted solidarity. He understood the rhythm of the sickness now. Sarah watched in awe, her own despair momentarily held at bay by the sheer, instinctive intelligence of it. Minutes before a wave of nausea would seize Liam, Bear would stir. He wouldn't tense or growl. He'd simply lift his head from where he lay draped across Liam's shins, amber eyes fixed on the boy's face. He'd emit that soft, questioning chirp Sarah had come to recognize. Ready? As Liam's body would begin its wretched convulsions, Bear would shift. He'd press his entire weight, warm and solid, against Liam's side or hip, not restraining, but grounding, an anchor in the violent sea of sickness. His deep purr, that resonant engine hum, a tangible vibration Liam could feel even through the tremors. Sarah saw it, the way her son's small body, tensing for the agony, would subtly relax into Bear's warmth and sound. Just a fraction. The purr wasn't magic. It didn't stop the vomiting, but it seemed to weave a fragile thread of connection, reminding Liam he wasn't alone in the abyss. And the licking. It never stopped. Whenever Liam lay still, exhausted, drifting in the drugged haze between pain and sleep, Bear would resume his meticulous grooming of the four-port site. So, deliberate strokes of his rough tongue over the clear plastic tape, the skin around it reddened and fragile. He'd lick until the fur around his own mouth was damp. Sarah worried at first about infection, about irritating the sensitive skin. But Marie checked. It came surprisingly gentle, actually, she'd murmured one evening, a note of wonder in her voice. Like he's tending it. He was. It was his offering, his ritual against the remembered horror. By tending this wound, this source of poison, he was reclaiming it, making it something cared for, something loved, even as it delivered pain. Sarah began to see it as a prayer, a scarred creature's benediction over another's suffering. One brutal afternoon, 3 days into the chemo siege, Liam hit a wall Sarah feared might be insurmountable. The nausea meds failed. He retched until blood vessels burst in his eyes, leaving crimson streaks in the whites. A thin, broken sound that scraped Sarah's soul raw. Make it stop, Mommy. Just make it stop. I can't do it anymore. He clawed weakly at the 4-line taped to his chest. Take it out. Take the poison out. Sarah's own resolve crumbled. She gathered him, sores and all, onto her lap in the narrow hospital bed. She rocked him, humming a tuneless lullaby, tears dripping onto his sweat-damp hair. I'm so sorry, my brave boy. I'm so sorry. Helplessness wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was the air she breathed. The poison was winning. It was breaking her son, and it was breaking her. Bear watched from the foot of the bed. His usual spot pressed against Liam was impossible with Sarah holding him. He didn't try to climb over. Just utterly. His amber gaze moving from Liam's tear-streaked, bloodshot eyes to Sarah's ravaged face. He saw the fracture, the moment when the weight threatened to snap them both. So, deliberately, Bear stood. He didn't approach Liam. He padded silently across the wrinkled sheets, past Liam's trembling legs, and stopped beside Sarah. He looked up at her, then nudged her elbow with his head, a firm, insistent pressure. Sarah blinked, her vision blurred. What? Bear? He nudged again, then turned his head, looking pointedly at the small space between her hip and the bed rail. Then back at her. His meaning was clear. Move over. Hesitantly, shifting Liam's limp weight, Sarah made a small space. Bear didn't hesitate. He flowed into the gap, curling his sturdy body tightly against Sarah's side. His back pressed firmly against her ribs. He was warm, a solid furnace of fur and muscle. He reached his head forward, stretching across Sarah's lap, and gently, so gently, began to lick Liam's bare forearm. Not the foresight this time, just the skin. So, soothing strokes. Sarah gasped. A fresh wave of tears welled, but different this time. Not despair. Overwhelming, humbling. Gratitude. The cat, this creature bearing his own invisible scars, wasn't just comforting Liam. He was holding her up. His body pressed against hers was a physical buttress, a silent reinforcement against the crushing weight of her son's suffering and her own guilt. His warmth seeped through her thin shirt, a grounding counterpoint to the cold dread in her veins. His rough tongue on Liam's arm was a tangible act of care, a reminder that love, in its purest, most instinctive form, was still present, still fighting. She leaned into him, just slightly, letting his solid warmth take a fraction of her burden. She buried her free hand in the thick fur of his neck, feeling the deep, steady thrum of his purr vibrate up her arm, into her chest, mingling with her own erratic heartbeat. Liam's sobs gradually subsided into exhausted hiccups, his body relaxing incrementally against hers, soothed by the rhythmic rasp of Bear's tongue. The three of them, wrapped in a tangle of shared suffering and fierce devotion, became a single unit, a fortress built not of stone, but of fur, and the relentless, quiet hum of a cat's purr. Life in room 312 settled into a grim, but strangely sacred, routine. The days blurred. Nights were long vigils punctuated by retching, whimpers, and Bear's low, constant purr. Sarah learned to sleep in snatches, her head resting against the back of the vinyl chair, one hand always touching Liam, the other often buried in Bear's fur. The cat became her barometer. His unwavering presence, his focused care, was the only thing that convinced her they weren't drowning. So, imperceptibly at first, the tide began to turn. 5 days after the chemo started, Liam kept down 3 spoonfuls of applesauce. A monumental victory. He managed a weak smile, directed at Bear, who sat attentively beside the bowl, watching every shaky spoonful. "See, Bear?" Liam whispered, his voice a raspy thread. "I ate it." Bear responded with a slow blink, his version of a smile. Dr. Evans came in. Her usual briskness softened. "His counts," she began, consulting the chart. "They're starting to respond, Sarah. The chemo, it's hitting the target. The nausea, the fatigue, it's terrible, but it's a sign it's working." Working. The word landed like a benediction. Sarah looked at Liam. "Sit now." Bear curled in his usual spot on his chest, grooming the 4 tape with gentle persistence. The poison was still inside him, still causing havoc, but it was also fighting. Bear's scar, Liam's port, they were battlefields, places where terrible things happened, but also places tended with fierce, unwavering love. Sarah walked to the window. The rain had returned, but softer now, a gentle spring rain washing the grime from the city. She looked at her reflection in the glass. Hollow eyes still, hair still escaping its knot, But something had shifted. The raw, flayed-open terror was still there, but layered over it now was something else. Resilience, forged not in defiance, but in surrender to the shared burden. She hadn't carried Liam alone. Bear had carried him too. And in carrying Liam, Bear had carried her. She turned back to the bed, to her son, fighting his invisible war, to the scarred black cat, his rough tongue a testament to his own survival, now offered as a balm for another. Bear looked up, meeting her gaze. His amber eyes, no longer wild with panic or heavy with remembered pain, held a quiet depth, a shared understanding. They had faced the abyss, not as human and animal, but as fellow travelers in the harsh land of suffering. They had seen each other's scars, inside and out, and instead of turning away, they had leaned in. Sarah moved back to the chair, not the stiff vinyl one. She pulled it closer, right up against the bed, and reached out one hand to rest lightly on Liam's blanketed foot. The other, she extended towards Bear. He didn't move towards her fingers. He simply lowered his head, resting his warm forehead against the back of her hand where it lay near Liam, the same spot he'd pressed into that first night he entered the room. A circle completed. The vigil continued. The machines beeped. The rain whispered. The chemo dripped. But the sound no longer held the same chilling terror. It was just a sound, part of the landscape they navigated together. Sarah closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to feel the slight weight of Bear's head on her hand, the faint rise and fall of Liam's breathing beneath Bear's purring weight, the quiet solidarity that bound them. The war wasn't over. There would be more battles, more poison, more nights of terror, but the crushing isolation, the feeling of being utterly alone in the universe with her child suffering, that was gone, replaced by the warm, steady, unbreakable presence of a creature who had chosen to share their burden, not out of duty, but out of a love forged in the recognition of shared scars. They were an island, but it was an island built on bedrock. Sarah, leaning into the warmth of the cat who remembered poison, finally understood the true meaning of the vigil. It wasn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It was about learning to stand together in the relentless rain. And in that standing, finding a strength she never knew she possessed, borrowed from the fierce, scarred heart of a cat named Bear. The healing wasn't just for Liam. It had already begun in her. In the quiet acceptance, the shared burden, the profound, wordless understanding that flowed between her hand and the warm forehead resting upon it. They were broken, all three of them, but they were broken together. And in that togetherness lay the fragile, unshakable beginnings of peace. The word felt foreign, fragile, like a soap bubble landing on pavement. Stepping back into their small, cluttered house after weeks in the sterile limbo of room 312 was overwhelming. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating dancing motes in the air. And the sheer normalcy of it, the pile of unopened mail on the table, a forgotten mug half full of cold coffee, Liam's crayon drawings taped haphazardly to the fridge, hit Sarah like a physical blow. It was the world continuing without them, a world that felt jarringly bright and terrifyingly unprotected. Liam was a ghost of himself, thin as a whisper, bald head covered in a soft blue beanie Sarah had knitted during the long nights. He moved with painful slowness, leaning heavily on her, his energy sapped by the chemo's lingering aftershocks. The vulnerability was agonizing. Every creak of the floorboard, Every gust of wind rattling the old window panes made Sarah flinch. The hospital's constant vigilance, the beeping monitors, the ever-present nurses were gone. The responsibility, the sheer, crushing weight of keeping him safe in this suddenly dangerous-seeming ordinary world, settled solely on her shoulders. The fragile piece she'd found in room 312 felt miles away, but, however, transitioned with a quiet certainty that became Sarah's anchor. He explored the familiar rooms with deliberate slowness, nose twitching, taking in the changed scents, lingering disinfectant from Sarah's frantic pre-homecoming clean, the faint, medicinal odor clinging to Liam's clothes. He didn't race to his old spots. He shadowed Liam. When Liam sank onto the worn living room sofa, exhausted from the short walk from the car, Bear leaped up beside him, not on the other end, but pressed firmly against his fragile side. When Liam shuffled to the bathroom, Bear paced beside him, a silent, black escort, pausing outside the door until the lock clicked open again. At night, instead of the foot of Liam's bed as before, Bear now slept curled tightly against the boy's chest, his head resting near Liam's chin, a living, purring heartbeat monitor. His amber eyes, reflecting the nightlight's glow, remained watchful, scanning the familiar shadows of the bedroom with a vigilance that hadn't eased. Sarah watched this new routine unfold, a knot of anxiety loosening slightly in her chest with every protective move Bear made. He was their sentinel, his instincts, honed in the crucible of the hospital, were now seamlessly woven into the fabric of their home. He seemed to understand the new rules. Liam was fragile. The world was full of unseen threats. Bear's job was the buffer. One rain-slicked afternoon, a week after coming home, Sarah faced Mount Laundry. Weeks of hospital scrubs, Liam's pajamas, blankets, all saturated with the unique, cloying scent of illness and antiseptic. She sorted mechanically in the small utility room off the kitchen, the rhythmic thump of the washing machine a dull counterpoint to the rain drumming on the roof. Fatigue clung to her like a second skin. She pulled a dark bundle from the bottom of the hamper, the thick hoodie she'd worn constantly in the hospital's chill. As she shook it out, preparing to turn the pockets inside out, something heavy and metallic clattered onto the linoleum floor. Sarah froze. It wasn't a coin. It was small, tarnished silver, attached to a loop of worn, cracked black leather. A cat collar. Her breath hitched. Bear's collar, the one he'd arrived with at the shelter, the one Liam had insisted on keeping even after they'd bought him a new, blue one with a jingly bell, which Bear had promptly learned to remove. Sarah had stuffed it into her hoodie pocket that first terrifying night in the hospital. A strange, superstitious talisman, and utterly forgotten about it. She bent down, her knees protesting, and picked it up. The leather was smooth and cool in her palm, worn thin in places. The small oval tag was scratched and dull, engraved on one side. She hadn't really looked at it closely before. At the shelter, it had just been part of the sad story of a surrendered cat. Liam had called it his secret medal. Holding it now, under the harsh fluorescent light of the utility room, Sarah felt a strange prickle on her skin. She rubbed her thumb over the engraved surface, wiping away a smudge of lint. The letters emerged, deeply cut, unfashionably blocky. Below the name, small, but just as clear. If found, please call Arthur, 5550197. Arthur. The name landed softly, but with surprising weight. Bear's first human. The elderly man who had died, leaving his cat alone. Sarah had known this, abstractly, but seeing the name, engraved with such care, made him suddenly, heartbreakingly real. A person, a man who had loved this cat enough to put a collar on him, to hope he'd be returned if lost. She flipped the tag over. She'd never thought to look at the other side, expecting blank metal, or perhaps a vaccination date. She instead found more engraving, just 2 words, smallest, nestled in the curve of the oval. Soldier on. Sarah's knees gave way. She sank onto the cold linoleum, the collar clutched tightly in her fist, the washing machine thumping rhythmically beside her. Soldier on. The words ricocheting off the bare walls of the utility room, sinking deep into the marrow of her exhaustion. They weren't just an instruction. They were a testament, a message from one weary soul to another. Cross loss. Arthur, an old man facing his own end, knowing he was leaving his beloved companion behind. What had his last days been like? Had he lain in a sterile room, listening to machines? Had he felt that same crushing weight of helplessness, the terror of leaving someone vulnerable behind? And in the face of that, he'd engraved these words onto his cat's collar. Soldier on. Forbear. The final, desperate act of love. A plea for resilience. A hope that his quiet, scarred companion would find the strength to keep living, to find a new reason, even after Arthur was gone. His hot and silent, spilled down Sarah's cheeks. She wasn't just crying for Arthur, or for Bear's loss. She was crying for the sheer, brutal universality of it. The love that persists, even in the face of leaving. The desperate hope we etch onto the world, onto the ones we love, when we know we won't be there to hold them up anymore. Soldier on. She thought of Bear in the hospital, his fierce protection, his instinctive care, his unwavering vigil. He had soldiered on, not just survived, but found a new purpose. He'd carried Arthur's final command in the very metal against his skin, and then, when Liam needed him, he'd lived it. He'd become the soldier Arthur had begged him to be, for a new boy, in a new battle. The scar on his hip, they weren't just wounds. They were his medals, proof he'd endured, proof he understood the cost, and the command. Soldier on. Sarah looked down at the worn tag in her palm. It wasn't just a piece of metal anymore. It was a baton, passed from Arthur to Bear, and now, lying heavy in her hand. Arthur hadn't just been speaking to his cat. He'd been speaking to anyone who would ever love Bear after him. To her, the relentless thump of the washing machine seemed to fade. The drumming rain softened. Sarah sat on the cold floor, the collar pressed against her heart, and let the truth wash over her. She wasn't alone in this fear, this responsibility, this exhausting, terrifying act of mothering a child through hell. Generations of love and loss stood behind her. Arthur's love for Bear, Bear's fierce, scarred devotion to Liam, and now, hers, a chain of resilience, forged in the fires of suffering, passed down through a tarnished silver tag. Soldier on. It wasn't a demand for stoic bravery. It was permission. Permission to be terrified, to be exhausted, to feel broken, but also permission to get up, to keep putting one foot in front of the other, to find the strength, not because it was easy, but because love demanded it, just as Arthur had demanded it of Bear, just as Bear, in his silent, purring way, demanded it of her every time he pressed his warm weight against Liam or nudged her hand. Sarah pushed herself up, her legs shaky but determined. She walked out of the utility room, The collars still clutched tightly. She found them in the living room. Liam was asleep on the sofa, a thin shaft of watery sunlight falling across his face. Bear lay stretched along his side, his head on Liam's stomach, rising and falling with the boy's shallow breaths. One amber eye opened a slit as Sarah approached, watching her. She didn't put the collar back on Bear. It belonged to a different time, a different soldier. She walked quietly to the small bookshelf near the window. There was a framed photo there, one she rarely looked at anymore. Her and Liam, years ago, on a beach, building a lopsided sandcastle, both laughing into the sun. A time before sickness, before fear. Sarah gently moved the photo aside. Behind it, tucked into the frame, she placed Bear's old collar. The tarnished tag, with its engraved name and its hidden message, caught the dim light. Bear, soldier on. She stepped back. It wasn't hidden. It was there, visible if you knew to look. A quiet monument nestled beside a memory of joy. Her touchstone, her reminder, not of the pain, but of the enduring love that outlasted it. Passed down like a sacred, scratched heirloom. She returned to the sofa. Bear's eye closed again, a slow blink of acknowledgement. Sarah sank down onto the worn carpet beside them, leaning her head against the sofa cushion near Liam's shoulder. She reached out, not to wake them, but to rest her hand lightly on Bear's back. She felt the deep, steady thrum of his purr, vibrating through his fur, through her hand, into her own weary bones. The rhythm was familiar now. A lullaby, a battle hymn, a promise. The rain softened to a drizzle. A patch of weak sunlight broke through the clouds, falling across the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny sparks of hope. Sarah watched Liam sleep, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks. She watched Bear, the soldier cat, standing guard. Her fingers traced the familiar ridge of the scar hidden beneath his fur near his hip. His silent metal. She didn't feel strong. She felt exhausted, bruised, but holding the image of the collar in her mind, feeling the vibration of Bear's purr beneath her hand. She felt something else too. A connection. A thread stretching back to a man named Arthur who had loved a cat enough to engrave a plea for resilience on his collar. Forward to her son, sleeping under the watchful eye of that same cat, now a veteran of a different war. And right here, in this quiet, sun-dappled moment, running through her own trembling heart, soldier on. It wasn't just a command etched in metal. It was the quiet, purring heartbeat of the scarred creature lying beside her son. It was the love that persisted, scratched and tarnished, but unbroken. It was the baton, now firmly held in her own hand. The gift wasn't the collar. It was the understanding, the knowledge that she was part of this chain, this lineage of love and endurance. And as long as Bear purred, as long as Liam breathed, her marching orders were clear. She closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth, the unwavering presence. And for the first time since walking back into this too bright, too loud, terrifyingly normal world, Sarah took a deep, unshaking breath. She was home, and she wasn't standing guard alone. Sunlight, real and warm, not the weak imitation filtering through hospital glass, pooled on the worn living room rug. It caught the dust motes dancing, not like sparks of hope anymore, but like tiny, celebratory fireworks. Summer had arrived while they weren't looking, pushing aside the relentless spring rain that had soundtracked their terror. The air hummed not with machines, but with the drowsy buzz of bees outside the open window, the distant shout of children playing in a yard down the street, the comforting thump-thump-thump of the old ceiling fan pushing warm air. Normalcy wasn't a jarring intrusion anymore. It was a balm, slowly soaking into their bruised spirits. Liam sat cross-legged on the floor, bathed in a patch of sun. He wasn't building sandcastles yet, but he was building. Carefully, deliberately, he stacked brightly colored wooden blocks, his tongue peeking out in concentration. The blue beanie was gone. Fine, downy fuzz, pale gold like cornsilk, covered his scalp. It was a miracle, a quiet, everyday miracle. He was still thin, his movements carrying a lingering fragility, a carefulness learned in the land of pain. But the glassy distance was gone from his eyes. They held focus, curiosity, a tentative reclaiming of his boyhood world. A half-eaten slice of buttered toast sat on a plate beside him, another victory, small and monumental. Bear lay sprawled beside him, a pool of liquid shadow in the sunshine. He wasn't draped protectively over Liam's chest, nor was he tensely scanning the room. He was relaxed, deeply, profoundly relaxed. One back leg kicked out, exposing the soft fur of his belly. His amber eyes were slits of contentment, watching Liam's block tower with lazy interest. His purr was a constant, low-frequency thrum Sarah felt more than heard, a vibration resonating through the floorboards, as fundamental as the Earth's own hum. It wasn't the urgent, resonant engine of the hospital vigil. This was the purr of deep peace. The purr of a soldier standing down, knowing the immediate battle was won. Sarah watched them from the armchair, a cup of cooling tea forgotten in her hands. The frantic energy, the hypervigilance that had thrummed through her every nerve ending for months, had finally, blessedly, begun to ebb. It wasn't gone. The fear lived in a small, quiet room inside her now, the door always slightly ajar. A scan next month. Blood work every week. The specter of relapse, a shadow that might never fully leave. But it wasn't the overlord anymore. It was a tenant she had learned, painfully, to live beside. Her gaze drifted to the bookshelf, to the framed photo of her and Liam laughing on a sun-drenched beach, sandcastles forgotten. And nestled beside it, catching the light, Bear's old collar. The tarnished silver tag. Bear. Soldier on. It wasn't just a reminder anymore, it was a quiet companion. A testament. Seeing it there, nestled beside pure, uncomplicated joy, didn't summon the crushing weight of responsibility she'd felt on the utility room floor. Instead, it whispered the lesson she'd absorbed bone deep in room 312, watching a scarred cat tend a poisoned boy. Love isn't a shield against pain. It doesn't make you invincible. It doesn't erase the terrifying fragility of life, the brutal randomness of illness, the gutting ache of watching someone you love suffer. Love, Sarah understood now, staring at the purring cat and the boy building a tower, is something far more profound, far more resilient. It's the witness, the unwavering presence in the storm. It's the rough tongue tending the wound, not stopping the poison, but refusing to let the sufferer face it alone. It's the warm weight pressed against a shivering side, grounding you when the world tilts. It's the purr that vibrates through terror, a tangible thread connecting you to the living world when despair tries to pull you under. Bear hadn't cured Liam. Medicine, brutal and necessary, had fought that battle. Bear hadn't erased Sarah's guilt or fear. Those were human burdens she'd carry always. What Bear had done, what Arthur, in engraving those words, had unknowingly set in motion, was show them how to soldier on. Not with stoic silence, but with shared vulnerability. Not by denying the pain, but by tending it together. His fierce loyalty, born from his own loss, his own scar, hadn't been a barrier against their suffering. It had been a bridge straight through the heart of it. He'd taught them that resilience wasn't the absence of breaking, but the way you held the pieces, your own and others, while you found the glue. Liam's tower wobbled precariously. He held his breath, tiny fingers hovering. It leaned, and then collapsed with a soft clatter of wood on wood. Liam blinked. A flicker of disappointment crossed his face, quickly replaced by a thoughtful frown. He didn't cry. He didn't look lost. He just started picking up the blocks, examining them, planning his next attempt. Bear lifted his head, not in alarm, but in quiet observation. He stretched, a long, luxurious arch of his back, his claws kneading the rug for a blissful moment. Then he lowered his head again, his chin resting on his paws, his gaze fixed on Liam's busy hands. A silent guardian, no longer braced for attack, but present for the quiet work of rebuilding. Sarah set her teacup down. The warmth in the room wasn't just from the sun. It radiated from this scene, the boy learning resilience block by block, the cat embodying it in his peaceful vigil, the collar on the shelf whispering its timeless plea. She walked over, not to help or instruct, but to join. She sank onto the sun-warmed rug beside Bear, folding her legs beneath her. She didn't touch Liam's blocks. She simply sat, present. Liam glanced up, a small, sunlit smile touching his lips. "It fell, Mommy." "I saw," Sarah said softly, matching his smile. "Looks like you're figuring out how to make it stronger." He nodded solemnly, already stacking again. Bear shifted slightly, pressing his warm flank against Sarah's leg. She rested her hand lightly on his back, feeling the deep, contented purr vibrate up her arm. She traced the familiar ridge beneath his fur near his hip, the hidden scar, his silent medal. It wasn't a mark of defeat anymore. It was a badge of endurance, a reminder that healing leaves its own maps. Arthur's face remained a mystery. Was he tall? Did he laugh easily? Did he sit in a worn armchair, Bear purring in his lap, as the evening light faded? Sarah didn't know, but she felt him. In the quiet strength of the cat he'd loved enough to engrave a final command. In the chain of care that stretched from an old man's bedside to a hospital room to this sunlit patch of rug. Arthur had loved Bear. Bear, carrying that love like an invisible torch, had loved Liam back from the edge of despair. And in loving Liam, he had shown Sarah how to love herself again, not as a perfect protector, but as a fellow traveler, scarred and scared, yet fiercely determined. Soldier on. It wasn't a roar. It was the quiet thrum under her palm. It was the focused frown on Liam's face as he placed another block. It was the sunlight warming the tarnished tag on the shelf. It was the simple, profound act of sitting on the floor, breathing the ordinary, miraculous air, surrounded by the living proof that love, however scratched, however tarnished, however born from loss, endures. It doesn't prevent the storms. It teaches you how to stand in the rain, hand in furry paw, heart to healing heart, building your tower again, block by fragile block, under the watchful, peaceful gaze of the soldier who remembers the battle, but chooses the purr. The world outside continued its noisy, vibrant life. Inside, on the worn rug, in the dappled summer sunlight, sat a boy, a woman, and a cat. No grand pronouncements. No fanfare. Just the soft clatter of wooden blocks. The deep, resonant purr of contentment. The shared, unspoken understanding that the most powerful stories aren't about escaping the dark, but about finding the extraordinary light that flickers, persistent and brave, within it. Bear's amber eyes, half closed, reflected the sun, holding the quiet, everlasting warmth of a love that had crossed every line, borne every burden, and found its way, purring, home. If this story of Bear's quiet courage, Liam's fragile strength, and Sarah's journey back to hope touched your heart, smash that like button. Let us know this kind of real, raw, emotional storytelling matters. Comment below. What moment hit you hardest? Have you ever experienced an animal's extraordinary empathy? Share your story. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that love, in its most unexpected forms, can be the strongest medicine. Subscribe and hit the bell icon. We publish deeply moving, true-feeling stories like this every single day. Don't miss the next journey that might just change how you see the world, one heartfelt moment at a time. Because sometimes, the most profound heroes have 4 paws, a rumbling purr, and a heart brave enough to love us through our darkest storms. Hit subscribe and join us for the next story that proves it.